Oh.
Aldient always be so kind. But it wasn't just the light-hearted lessons. There were harder days, too, when Derrick's anger or sadness bubbled to the surface in ways I wasn't sure how to manage. Like the time his baseball coach benched him for an entire season because he had missed one too many practices to help me around the house. Derrick had stormed into the kitchen, slamming his bag onto the floor, his face dark with frustration. "It's not fair," he yelled. "I try so hard and it's never enough." I'd let him rage for a moment, my own heart breaking for him before I spoke. "Life isn't always fair, Derrick," I said softly, "but you can't let it make you bitter. You can only control how you respond. And sometimes that's enough to turn things around." He didn't say anything, just nodded, the fight in him ebbing away as he sank into a chair. That night, I watched him write an email to his coach, apologizing and explaining. The next morning, the coach called to say he could come back to the team. Derrick's face lit up with a grin, so wide it nearly split my heart in two. Now, as I look at him standing tall in our small kitchen, his hands deftly making a sandwich, something I taught him, of course, I can't help but feel a swell of pride. "You know," I say, leaning against the counter, "you've come a long way, kiddo." He turns to me with that crooked smile, the one that still feels a little boyish despite his broad shoulders and steady confidence. "It's because I have the best teacher," he replies. And in that moment, I realize that while I may have taught Derrick the mechanics of life, how to tie his shoes, win over a girl, or fight for what he believes in, he has taught me too. He's taught me resilience, patience, and that even when life doesn't go as planned, it can still be beautiful in its own messy, unpredictable way. We've made it this far together, Derrick and me, and though I know he's on the cusp of forging his own path, of stepping into a future I won't always be a part of, I also know the bond we've built will hold us steady, no matter where life takes us. Derrick had been pacing the living room for the past 20 minutes, his sneakers squeaking against the hardwood floor. Every so often, he'd glance at his phone, then shove it back into his pocket, muttering something under his breath. I watched him from the kitchen, trying not to laugh as he ran a hand through his hair for the 5th time, making it stick up in all directions. "Derrick," I finally called, setting down my mug of tea. "If you keep this up, you're going to wear a groove into the floor." He stopped pacing and turned to me, his face a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "Mom, I need advice." This wasn't new. Derrick had been coming to me for advice since he was old enough to ask questions. But the way he said it now, his voice a little quieter, a little more uncertain, made me realize this wasn't just about school or sports or how to fix something. This was different. "All right," I said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table and gesturing for him to sit. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment before dropping into the chair across from me. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and fiddled with the strap of his watch. "It's about Nancy." Nancy. She'd come over a few times, a sweet girl with soft brown curls, and a laugh that seemed to make Derrick's whole face light up. I'd noticed the way he looked at her, like she was the only person in the room, and I'd caught her stealing glances at him when she thought no one was watching. Young love. There was nothing quite like it. "What about Nancy?" I asked gently, though I had a feeling I already knew. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Things are getting I don't know, more serious." His voice rose slightly at the end, as if he weren't entirely sure of the words himself. I tilted my head, waiting for him to continue. "We've only kissed so far," he said quickly, his cheeks turning a deep shade of red. "But I think she wants to, take things further." There it was. "Okay," I said carefully, keeping my expression neutral. "And how do you feel about that?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, I like her. A lot. But I don't want to mess things up, and I don't know what I'm doing." He buried his face in his hands. "God, this is so embarrassing." "It's not embarrassing, Derrick," I said, reaching across the table to pat his arm. "It's normal. Everyone feels nervous their first time." He peeked at me through his fingers. "You're not going to tell me to ask Dad about this, are you?" The corner of my mouth twitched. "Would you want me to?" He shook his head vehemently. "No offense, but Dad would probably just tell me to read a book or something." I chuckled, though the truth of his words stung a little. Lewis had always been better with abstract ideas than emotional conversations, and intimacy was a subject he treated with clinical detachment. If Derrick needed guidance, it would have to come from me. Well, I said, choosing my words carefully, if you really want to know, I'll tell you. But only if you're sure you're ready to hear it. He nodded, his expression earnest. I want to know, Mom. I don't want to mess things up with her. She's special. The way he said it, with such conviction, made my heart ache a little. He was no longer the little boy who needed me to tie his shoes or read him bedtime stories. He was a young man, trying to navigate the complexities of love, and I felt both proud and bittersweet about how far we'd come. All right, I said, folding my hands on the table. First of all, it's important that you're both on the same page. Talk to her, Derrick. Make sure she feels ready, and that you're not rushing into anything just because you think it's what she wants. He nodded, absorbing every word. Second, I continued, communication is key. If you're unsure about something, ask her. If something feels off, talk about it. Intimacy isn't just physical. It's about trust and understanding each other. His brow furrowed. But what if I say the wrong thing? Or do the wrong thing? You're going to make mistakes, I said gently. And that's okay. No one gets it perfect the first time. Or the second or the third. What matters is that you're respectful, and that you're listening to her. If you're nervous, tell her. She'll appreciate your honesty. He exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. And Derrick, I added, my tone serious now, make sure you're being safe. Do you need me to? I already bought some. He interrupted, his face turning red again. Just in case. I smiled, relieved that he'd been responsible enough to think ahead. Good. That's important. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling between us. Then Derrick looked up at me, his eyes full of gratitude. Thanks, Mom. For, not making this weird. I laughed, reaching over to ruffle his hair. It's my job to make sure you're prepared for the big stuff, even if it's a little awkward. That evening, as Derrick left for his date with Nancy, I stood at the window, watching him jog to his car. He looked back once, giving me a quick wave, and I waved back, my heart full of a strange mix of emotions. I had taught him everything. How to love, how to respect, how to navigate the world with kindness and courage. But as he drove off to meet Nancy, I realized there was one thing I couldn't teach him. How to let go of my own little boy. I suggested the restaurant partly for his nerves, and partly for mine. Derrick had been so jittery after his date with Nancy, that it was hard to know whether he was overthinking what happened, or whether the kiss had left him feeling something new and unexplored. Watching him like this stirred emotions in me, ones I kept buried beneath layers of routine and responsibility. Why don't we go out for dinner tonight? I said casually, hoping my voice didn't betray the quiet thrum in my chest. Something nice. And maybe after, we can take a walk. Fresh air might help you clear your mind. He hesitated, clearly surprised. Really? You'd want to? Of course. I replied with a smile that I hoped felt easy and natural. It'll do us both some good. That's how we ended up at the small Italian restaurant downtown. A warm, intimate place with soft lighting, and a quiet hum of conversations around us. Derrick seemed more relaxed here. His shoulders no longer hunched, and the slight crease between his brows beginning to smooth out. As we waited for our food, I leaned forward, resting my chin on my hand. You've been quiet since your date. Was it everything you hoped for? He hesitated, running a hand through his hair in that nervous habit of his. It was fine. I mean, Nancy's great, But, he trailed off, looking down at the glass of water in his hand. But, I prompted gently. She kissed me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I felt like I was doing it wrong or something. Like I wasn't present enough. Derrick. I reached across the table and touched his hand lightly. You're overthinking. Kisses don't come with a manual. They're just moments. You don't have to dissect them. Just feel them. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine for answers I wasn't sure I could give him. Is that how it works? You just feel. I smiled softly, letting my hand linger for just a moment before pulling back. Yes. And it's okay to feel nervous too. It's human. Our conversation shifted after that, moving to lighter topics, his classes, his plans for the summer. But I couldn't stop noticing how much more at ease he became, as though calling me Leah instead of Mom had created a new layer of comfort between us. After dinner, we walked along the waterfront, the moon casting a silver glow over the rippling waves. The crisp night air carried the faint scent of salt and seaweed, mingling with the lingering aroma of garlic and basil from the restaurant. Derrick seemed lighter now, his stride less hesitant. "You're really easy to talk to," he said suddenly, breaking the companionable silence. "Good. I want you to feel that way," I replied with a smile, though my pulse quickened at his words. When we got home, I stretched my arms above my head, pretending not to notice the way Derrick's eyes flickered over me as I moved. "I've been on my feet all day," I said with a mock sigh. "Think you could give me one of your famous massages?" His brows lifted in surprise. "Famous? I didn't know they were famous." "They will be," I teased, sinking onto the couch. "Come on, don't make me beg." He laughed softly and moved to sit behind me, his hands hovering uncertainly over my shoulders before settling into place. His touch was tentative at first, his fingers kneading lightly against my muscles as though afraid of hurting me. "Derrick, you're not going to break me," I said, my tone playful. "A little more pressure, please." He obeyed, his grip firming slightly as he worked his thumbs into the tension in my shoulders. I let out a quiet sigh, my eyes drifting closed. There was something grounding about his touch, a tenderness that felt different now that he was no longer a boy, but a man trying to find his way. "You're good at this," I murmured. "Thanks," he said softly. "I just want to make sure I'm doing it right." "You are," I assured him, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the room felt impossibly quiet, save for the faint rustle of his movements and the soft cadence of our breaths. I told myself this was nothing more than a mother asking her son for help, a moment of shared comfort after a long day. But as his hands moved lower, tracing the line of my spine, I couldn't ignore the warmth spreading through me, the kind that didn't belong here. "Derrick," I said, sitting up slightly and turning to face him. His hands fell away, and his gaze flickered with uncertainty, perhaps sensing the shift in me. "You've been carrying too much stress," I said quickly, masking my thoughts with a light laugh. "You should take some time for yourself too." "Maybe," he said quietly, his eyes holding mine for just a beat too long before he looked away. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted. Something I wasn't ready to name. It started subtly, like a change in the air that you can't quite pinpoint, but feel all the same. Derrick lingered more often, whether I was in the kitchen flipping through cookbooks or curled up on the couch reading. He always seemed to be near, finding small ways to fill the spaces between us. At first, I told myself it was natural. He'd had a tough time with Nancy, and I was his safe harbor, the person he could confide in without fear of judgment. I'd always been there for him, hadn't I? But the ease between us took on a new quality, something quieter, more charged. One afternoon, I was tending to the garden in the backyard when I noticed him standing on the porch, watching me. His gaze was steady, thoughtful, as though he was trying to memorize the moment. "What are you looking at?" I asked playfully, brushing the dirt off my hands. "You," he said simply, a small smile playing at his lips. The honesty of his answer startled me. I laughed softly, waving him off. "Come help me with these then. It's not going to plant itself." He joined me, kneeling beside me in the soil. We worked side by side, our hands brushing occasionally as we arranged flowers in neat rows. Each touch sent a subtle jolt through me, a reminder of how aware I'd become of him. Not as my son, but as someone standing on the cusp of adulthood, navigating the complex waters of identity and connection. "You're good at this," I said, breaking the silence as he patted the soil around a marigold. "I might have to make you my gardening partner." "Anytime," he replied, his voice soft but warm. "I like spending time with you." I glanced at him, and for a moment our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, something unspoken but heavy with meaning. I quickly looked away, focusing on the flower in front of me. The days passed, and Derrick's presence became a constant. We cooked together, took walks along the waterfront, and watched old movies late into the night. He was attentive in a way that caught me off guard, noticing the smallest details about me, like how I hummed when I was deep in thought, or the way I liked my tea with just a touch of honey. You make things easy, he said one evening as we sat on the porch, the sun setting in a wash of gold and pink. Easy, I echoed, smiling. Yeah, with you, I don't have to try so hard. I can just be myself. His words hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I swallowed hard, keeping my tone light. That's what family's for, Derrick. He nodded but didn't say anything, his expression distant as he stared at the horizon. The silence between us stretched, comfortable yet laden with something I couldn't quite define. One evening, after a particularly long day, I stretched out on the couch, letting the quiet of the house wash over me. Derrick appeared in the doorway, his hair slightly disheveled, the faint scent of soap clinging to him. Hey, he said, his voice soft. Mind if I join you? Of course not, I said, patting the space beside me. He sat down, and I was immediately aware of how close he was, closer than he usually sat. I could feel the warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. For a while, we sat in silence, the only sound the faint hum of the TV. Leah, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, my heart inexplicably speeding up at the way he said my name. What is it? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. I don't know how to say this without it sounding weird. Just say it, I said gently. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine. I think I have feelings for you. Real feelings. Not the kind I'm supposed to have. The words hung in the air, a weight that settled between us. My breath caught, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Derrick, I began, my voice trembling. You're confused. It's normal to feel close to someone who's always been there for you. But it's not confusion, he interrupted, his voice firm. I know what I feel. I've tried to ignore it, but I can't. Being with you, it's different. It's easy, it's right. My heart pounded in my chest. The lines I'd so carefully drawn between us suddenly blurred. This isn't we can't, I stammered. But even as I said the words, I couldn't bring myself to move away. I know it's not right, he said, his voice breaking. But I had to tell you. I couldn't keep pretending. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the air between us charged with emotions too complex to name. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he leaned in, his lips brushing mine in a kiss so soft, so tentative, that it left me breathless. I pulled back, my mind racing. Derrick, we can't, this can't happen. I'm sorry, he said quickly, his face a mixture of guilt and longing. I didn't mean to. I placed a hand on his arm, silencing him. This is complicated. We need to be careful. But I don't want to lose what we have. He nodded, his gaze searching mine. I don't either. That night, I lay awake in bed, the memory of his kiss replaying in my mind. It was a moment that had changed everything. And though I told myself it couldn't happen again, I couldn't ignore the quiet thrill it had stirred in me. Derrick's feelings were out in the open now, and the boundary we'd crossed would be impossible to uncross. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain. Our relationship had shifted irrevocably, and there was no going back.
Bye.